Hello viewers, let me ask you this. Do you think there are secrets so big they could shake an entire nation? Share your thoughts in the comments. Today's story takes us inside Diddy's childhood home, where shocking discoveries have been made that have everyone talking. Chapter 1. The Raid. It started as a quiet morning in an upscale New York neighborhood, but that peace shattered in an instant. Federal agents in black SUVs swarmed the sprawling mansion of Janice Combs, mother of the controversial Sean Diddy Combs. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, their curiosity piqued as law enforcement officers, armed with warrants and determination, marched up the stone steps to the grand front door. The hum of hushed conversations and snapping cameras buzzed outside, hinting that something monumental was about to unfold. This wasn't just another raid. It was a targeted operation tied to the ongoing legal troubles of one of the entertainment industry's most polarizing figures. Sean Combs, once celebrated for his larger-than-life persona and cultural influence, had become a central figure in multiple allegations of misconduct, from lawsuits alleging sexual abuse to accusations of orchestrating freak-offs. His name had become synonymous with scandal. But what was the connection to his mother Janice and her mansion? That question alone was enough to send shockwaves through the media and the public. Janice Combs was no stranger to attention. A fiercely protective matriarch, she had been a constant figure in Diddy's rise to fame, standing by his side through all the controversies, allegations, rumors, and anything else that has come in her son's way. To many, she was simply a proud mother who worked tirelessly to provide for her children after the tragic death of her husband, Melvin Combs. But her glamorous exterior often obscured the whispers about her past. Rumors of wild parties, shadowy guests, and a lifestyle that seemed worlds apart from the white picket fence ideal. For years, Janice's mansion was seen as a symbol of her family's success, a testament to her resilience and ambition. But the raid suggested something darker, a skeleton in the closet that had been waiting decades to resurface. Agents meticulously combed through the property, armed with tools to unearth secrets long buried. The air around the mansion grew heavy, almost as if the house itself was holding its breath. What could they be looking for? Whispers began to spread. Some speculated it was tied to Diddy's ongoing federal charges, including allegations of sex trafficking and racketeering. Others thought it might be unrelated, a separate investigation entirely. Regardless of the reason, the raid confirmed one thing: the Combs family mansion wasn't just a home. It was a vault of untold stories. To understand the gravity of the situation, one must look back at Diddy's turbulent childhood. Raised in Mount Vernon, New York, after the murder of his father, Diddy grew up in an environment that was anything but ordinary. His mother worked multiple jobs to make ends meet, and while her efforts were commendable, the lifestyle she maintained raised eyebrows. Her mansion, described by childhood friends as a lively hub of activity, hosted parties that were the stuff of local legend. Alcohol flowed freely, the air was thick with smoke, and the guest list was a mix of Harlem's elite and streetwise regulars. For young Sean, this was normal. But normal for one person can be haunting for another. As federal agents moved deeper into the mansion, it became clear that they weren't just conducting a routine search. The meticulous nature of their operation suggested they were looking for something specific, something that could tie decades-old events to the present day. Rooms were sealed off. Reporters began to speculate. What could have been hidden in this house for so long? Had Janice's infamous parties left behind more than memories? Rumors swirled about the mansion's basement, a space said to be off-limits to most guests. Was there a connection between the house's history and the allegations against Diddy? The timing of the raid was no coincidence, and the questions it raised were too big to ignore. Diddy. As agents emerged with boxes of evidence, one thing was clear: this wasn't just about Sean Combs. The raid suggested a broader investigation, one that reached back into his family's past and sought to uncover the roots of behaviors and patterns that had followed him into adulthood. The mansion, long thought to be a peaceful retreat, was now at the center of a firestorm. The whispers about Janice parties were no longer just whispers. They were now under the scrutiny of federal authorities, and the implications could be devastating. What secrets did this house hold? What had been preserved in its walls, its rooms, its hidden spaces? As investigators loaded the evidence into waiting vehicles, the answers remained elusive. But one thing was certain: this was only the beginning. And so, as the mansion's gates swung shut behind the last of the federal vehicles, the neighborhood returned to an uneasy quiet. But the questions lingered. What had been uncovered inside? What ties did it have to Diddy's tumultuous life? And most importantly, how far back did the darkness go? For now, the answers were sealed in evidence bags, but the truth was bound to come out, and when it did, it would shake the nation. Chapter 2. A House of Secrets. What would you do if the walls of your childhood home could talk? For the Combs family, it seems those walls might have a lot to say. As federal agents continued their meticulous sweep of Janice Combs' mansion, whispers about its notorious history began to bubble to the surface. This wasn't just any house. It was a mansion with secrets buried in every room. Secrets that some claimed shaped Sean Diddy Combs into the man he is today. Long before federal agents arrived, the mansion was already infamous in certain circles. In the 1970s and 80s, Janice Combs was known for hosting elaborate, boisterous gatherings that drew a wide array of guests. By day, she was the hard-working single mother who had survived the loss of her husband, Melvin, to violent crime. But by night, her home transformed into a lively hub of activity that blurred the lines between celebration and chaos. Childhood friends of Diddy, such as Tim Patterson, often reminisced about those nights, though not fondly. Patterson described the mansion as a place where young Diddy was exposed to things most children could barely comprehend. Alcohol was everywhere, reefer smoke filled the air, and the people, they weren't just neighbors or family friends. Patterson once shared, you had drug addicts, pimps, and pushers rubbing shoulders with each other. It wasn't the kind of crowd you'd expect at a single mother's home. These weren't occasional gatherings, they were a regular part of life. Patterson claimed that Janice's parties became a staple of the neighborhood, drawing people from all walks of life, including figures from Harlem's underworld. Guests reportedly ranged from local street hustlers to more prominent individuals with ties to criminal enterprises. It was a melting pot of personalities and vices, and for young Diddy, it was the backdrop of his formative years. The stories from inside the mansion grew more unsettling with each retelling. Patterson described accidentally walking into rooms where inappropriate scenes unfolded, adults engaging in acts that a child should never witness. There was nothing hidden about it, he said. That was just the way it was. To us, it was normal. This normalization of chaos became the fabric of Diddy's childhood, shaping his understanding of relationships, power, and even morality. Another voice from Diddy's past, DJ Easy Lee, echoed similar sentiments. Although he claimed he never attended the infamous gatherings, he heard enough from those who did to understand their reputation. It was wild, man, he said. People talked about it like it was some underground scene, but it was happening right in their house. And it wasn't just about partying. It felt like there was always something more going on. This something more was a source of endless speculation. While many saw the parties as harmless fun, others whispered about darker dealings. Stories circulated about private meetings in locked rooms, heated arguments that spilled out into the yard, and even visits from figures connected to Harlem's notorious drug trade, with Melvin Combs' documented ties to infamous drug kingpins like Nicky Barnes and Frank Lucas. The presence of such guests wasn't entirely surprising, but it was deeply unsettling. As the federal agents scoured the mansion, these stories seemed to gain new weight. The house, which had long stood as a symbol of Janice's resilience and success, now felt like a vault of hidden truths. Could evidence of those wild nights still linger in its walls? Could it hold the key to understanding not only Janice's past, but also Diddy's present troubles? So, Patterson often reflected on how those parties shaped the way he and Diddy viewed the world. "We didn't see it as wrong back then," he admitted. "It was just life." But looking back, you realize how much of it wasn't okay. It desensitized us to things we should have been protected from. This desensitization may explain some of Diddy's later controversies, including his alleged involvement in organizing the so-called freak-offs described in recent lawsuits. The mansion, it seemed, was more than a home. It was a blueprint. But for the federal agents, this wasn't just about reconstructing a childhood or unraveling a family's complicated dynamics. They were after something tangible, something that could connect the dots between Janice's alleged gatherings and Diddy's current legal troubles. And as the evidence bags began to pile up, it became clear that the house had more to offer than anyone had imagined. What could still remain after all these years? According to Patterson, Janice's parties were legendary not just for their scale, but for their recklessness. It wasn't uncommon for guests to leave behind incriminating items. Letters, photographs, even recordings. If the walls of the mansion could talk, they'd likely tell stories of deals made in whispers, moments captured in the haze of smoke, and a young boy absorbing it all without understanding the consequences. It had uncovered more than a connection to the past. It had opened a Pandora's box of questions. How much did Janice know about what went on in her home? Was she merely a host, or did she play a larger role in the activities that unfolded there? And most importantly, what had been preserved within the house's walls, waiting for decades to be found? The answers remained hidden for now, locked away in evidence bags and sealed under the weight of legal scrutiny. But one thing was certain: the mansion's history was far from innocent, and its secrets were far from ordinary. As agents moved deeper into the house, the air grew heavier, charged with the tension of discovery. What lay ahead could rewrite not only the story of Janice Combs, but also the legacy of her son. And this was only the beginning. The true extent of what the mansion held was yet to be revealed, but the implications were already sending shockwaves through the community. The walls of Janice's mansion had finally started to talk, and what they were saying was terrifying. Chapter 3: The Basement Revelations. What lies beneath often reveals the truth. As federal agents continued their painstaking search of Janice Combs' mansion, their focus shifted to the basement. To most, basements are a space for storage, filled with forgotten boxes and dusty relics of the past. But in this house, a house steeped in whispered secrets and shadowy history, it was more than just a basement. It was a vault of answers, waiting to be uncovered. Agents had already scoured the upper floors, meticulously examining bedrooms, closets, and living spaces for anything that might connect the mansion's past to the present investigation. But the basement presented an entirely different challenge. The air grew colder as they descended the creaking wooden stairs, the dim light casting long shadows across the cracked concrete floor. It was clear that this space had not been touched in years, maybe even decades. What they found was chilling. Old trunks and wooden crates lined the walls, some secured with rusted padlocks. Stacks of cardboard boxes, yellowed with age, teetered precariously in one corner. The faint smell of mildew and decay filled the room, a stark contrast to the polished opulence of the floors above. And yet, amidst the dust and disarray, there was a sense that this was where the real story lay hidden. As the agents began opening the boxes and crates, the basement's secrets started to spill out. Inside were artifacts from a bygone era, vintage party invitations printed on thick cardstock, handwritten guest lists, and Polaroid photographs capturing the wild energy of Janice's infamous gatherings. The photos were a time capsule of excess, crowds of people dancing, laughing, and toasting with glasses of champagne. But as the agents examined the images more closely, a darker pattern began to emerge. In some photos, faces that appeared carefree at first glance seemed to mask something else. An edge of tension, a forced smile. The guest lists contained names that raised eyebrows, including several known figures from Harlem's underworld, men who were once associated with crime bosses like Nicky Barnes and Frank Lucas, appeared scrawled in faded ink beside more innocuous entries. The connections were subtle, but they were there. Then came the most unsettling find, a stack of film reels, neatly labeled and stored in metal canisters. The labels, written in Janice's distinctive cursive handwriting, bore cryptic titles like Saturday Night Fun and Harlem Elite. The agents loaded one of the reels into an old projector found in the basement, and as the flickering images came to life on the wall, the true nature of these parties began to unfold. The footage showed scenes of extravagant revelry, lavish spreads of food and drink, guests dressed to the nines, and music blaring from turntables. But as the reels continued, the content grew more disturbing. There were moments that no child should have been exposed to, explicit acts performed openly, arguments escalating into physical altercations, and interactions that hinted at darker dealings behind closed doors. Among the faces in the footage were those of young Sean Combs, wide-eyed and observant, moving through the crowd like a child lost in a world far beyond his understanding. The images of him witnessing these scenes added an eerie layer to the evidence. This wasn't just about parties. It was about an environment that shaped a boy into a man now facing some of the most damning allegations of his life. But the most shocking discovery came in the form of a leather-bound journal found tucked away in a locked chest. Its pages were filled with handwritten notes, detailing the parties in chilling detail. The entries included dates, guest lists, and cryptic references to transactions and special visitors. One entry even described a meeting involving a well-known Harlem figure, referencing sums of money exchanged and promises made. The journal painted a picture that was far more complex than anyone had imagined. These weren't just social gatherings, they were events where deals were struck, alliances were forged, and boundaries were pushed. The mansion's basement, once thought to be just another part of the house, had become the epicenter of activity that blurred the lines between indulgence and illegality. The implications of these findings were staggering. For years, Janice Combs had been seen as a hard-working single mother who did what she could to provide for her children. But the evidence suggested a far murkier reality, one where her parties may have played a role in facilitating connections between figures from the criminal world and others seeking to profit from Harlem's underbelly. And what about Sean? How much did he absorb from this environment? The images of him in the film reels, coupled with the details in the journal, hinted at a childhood where boundaries were non-existent, where exposure to vice and power was a daily occurrence. It raised questions about how much of what he witnessed as a child influenced the man he would become. The agents emerged from the basement with boxes of evidence, their expressions grim. They knew the weight of what they had uncovered. This wasn't just about a family's past. It was about a legacy of secrets that had the potential to unravel reputations and lives. As they carried the artifacts up the stairs, the mansion seemed to grow quieter, as if it too was processing the revelation of its deepest, darkest truths. But the story was far from over. The items from the basement were only the beginning, a prelude to what could become one of the most shocking investigations in recent history. The walls of Janice Combs' mansion had finally begun to speak, and what they revealed was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Chapter 4. The Guests Who Weren't Invited. Sometimes the most shocking revelations come from the people who were left out. While the federal raid and the basement's secrets dominated headlines, a quieter story began to unfold in the background. It was the whispered accounts of those who had never stepped foot inside Janice Combs' mansion, but knew enough to be wary of it. They painted a picture of a world that wasn't entirely visible to the naked eye, but left enough shadows to provoke suspicion. One of those voices belonged to DJ Easy Lee, a childhood acquaintance of Sean Diddy Combs and a fixture in Harlem's hip-hop scene during its early days. While DJ Easy Lee never attended the infamous parties, he'd heard plenty about them. "You didn't have to be there to know what was going on," he said in an interview years later. It wasn't just a party house, it was something else entirely. People talked about it like it was one of those places where things happened, things you didn't want your name attached to. The rumors swirled around the mansion like a storm cloud. Neighbors whispered about limousines pulling up late at night with passengers dressed in fine suits and glittering jewelry. These weren't ordinary partygoers. They were Harlem's elite and street-level figures, people whose names carried weight in both legitimate business and the shadowy underworld. Stories circulated about card games that went on for hours, fueled by cash that seemed to flow as freely as the champagne. Some even speculated that the mansion was a safe haven for backroom deals and quiet negotiations that couldn't happen elsewhere. DJ Easy Lee recalled how his own parents would warn him to steer clear of the house. "My mom used to say, 'Nothing good happens there after dark,'" he said. Even as a kid, I could tell that she wasn't just talking about the noise or the people. There was a real sense that the house had its own energy, and it wasn't the kind you wanted to be around. For those who did attend, the mansion was a world of excess that seemed almost surreal. Tim Patterson, one of Diddy's childhood friends, often talked about the people who walked through those doors. You had everyone, from drug dealers and pimps to politicians and business people, he claimed. It was like this strange mix where the streets met the suits. You'd see guys who were running things in Harlem, rubbing elbows with people you'd never think they'd even talk to. This mix of attendees was both intriguing and troubling. On the surface, it looked like a melting pot of ambition and power, but underneath it hinted at something far darker. The presence of Harlem's underworld figures wasn't just about socializing. It suggested a network of alliances and transactions that extended beyond the confines of the mansion. One particularly chilling rumor involved a well-known figure in the Harlem drug trade, a man whose name was whispered in hushed tones. It was said that he was a regular at Janice's gatherings, often seen in deep conversation with other prominent guests. Some claim these conversations led to deals that shaped the balance of power in Harlem's criminal hierarchy. While these rumors were never confirmed, they added another layer of complexity to the mansion's reputation. The federal raid only intensified these suspicions. As more evidence emerged from the mansion, questions arose about the nature of these gatherings. Were they merely parties, or were they something more? The discovery of the journal in the basement seemed to suggest the latter. Its entries detailed not only the guest lists, but also cryptic notes about agreements and arrangements. While the journal didn't explicitly name the parties involved, it was enough to raise eyebrows among investigators. One entry in particular stood out. Dated during a time when Diddy was still a child, it referenced a late-night meeting involving several unnamed guests. The note described discussions about distribution and payment in full by week's end. While the language was vague, its implications were hard to ignore. Could this have been a reference to drug trafficking or another illicit activity? And if so, what role did the mansion play in facilitating these operations? The implications of these findings were staggering. If true, they painted a picture of a house that wasn't just a backdrop for wild parties, but a central hub in a network of power and corruption. It wasn't just about Janice Combs or her guests. It was about the connections and deals that might have been forged within those walls. For DJ Easy Lee, these revelations brought back a flood of memories. "You always hear people say, 'If those walls could talk,'" he said. "But in this case, I think they finally are. And what they're saying isn't pretty. It makes you wonder how much of what happened back then is still affecting things today." The raid also reignited debates about Diddy's upbringing and how much of his environment shaped him. The image of a young Sean Combs wandering through these gatherings, absorbing the sights and sounds, painted a sobering picture. How much of what he witnessed influenced the man he would become? Did these early experiences normalize behavior that later manifested in the allegations against him? But the story didn't stop there. The artifacts and records found in the mansion hinted at broader connections, possibly implicating individuals far beyond the Combs family. Investigators were reportedly sifting through the evidence for links to larger criminal networks, including those tied to the Harlem drug trade. The mansion's history was no longer just a family matter. It was becoming a national scandal with far-reaching implications. As the story unfolded, the mansion itself seemed to take on a new identity. No longer just a relic of Janice Combs' past, it was now a symbol of how secrets can fester in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to be exposed. And while the guests who weren't invited to those parties may have only seen the edges of the truth, their stories added depth to a narrative that was as complex as it was unsettling. The raid had turned over more than just physical artifacts. It had opened a window into a world that many had only glimpsed from the outside. And as the investigation continued, it became clear that this was just the beginning. The mansion's secrets were slowly coming to light, and the more they revealed, the more questions they raised. The next steps in the investigation would delve even deeper into the mansion's past, uncovering not just the people who walked through its doors, but the deals and decisions that were made within its walls. The truth was out there, waiting to be pieced together, and its implications were terrifying. Chapter 5: Early Exposure. Can a childhood shaped by chaos create an adult drawn to the same? For Sean Diddy Combs, this question lingers at the core of the ongoing investigation into his family's past. As the findings from Janice Combs' mansion continued to emerge, they didn't just reveal details about wild parties, they shed light on an environment that may have shaped Diddy's perception of the world in profound and troubling ways. Growing up in Mount Vernon, New York, Sean was thrust into a dual reality. On one side, he was a typical kid navigating school, sports, and friendships. On the other, he was a young boy living in a house where adult behaviors were on full display, normalized and even celebrated. His mother, Janice, was a figure of strength and ambition, determined to give her children opportunities despite the odds stacked against them. But the means to that end came with complications. By her own accounts, Janice worked tirelessly to keep her family afloat after the murder of Sean's father, Melvin Combs. She was the glue that held the family together, but she also hosted gatherings that drew an eclectic mix of guests, many of whom were far removed from the world of PTA meetings and Little League games. Tim Patterson, one of Sean's childhood friends, described these parties as chaotic and overwhelming. There was no filter in that house, he said. Sean saw everything, things a kid should never see. This lack of boundaries left a lasting impression on young Sean. He watched as adults drank, smoked, and interacted in ways that were far beyond his understanding at the time. The mansion, which should have been a safe haven, became a place where the lines between childhood and adulthood were blurred. It was confusing, Patterson recalled. One minute, we'd be talking about cartoons, and the next, we'd walk into a room where things were happening that I still don't want to talk about. Diddy has spoken openly about how these early experiences influenced him. In interviews, he often frames his childhood as a time of survival and rapid growth. "I had to grow up fast," he told Vibe magazine in 1999. "I didn't have a choice." This sentiment was echoed in his admissions about early exposure to adult behaviors. He once recounted sneaking sips of alcohol from abandoned glasses at his mother's parties and watching interactions unfold with a mix of curiosity and confusion. One of the most shocking revelations from these interviews was his admission that he lost his virginity at an early age, an experience he has described with both bravado and a tinge of regret. "I was just a kid, but it felt like I had to act like an adult," he said. Looking back, I realize how much that messed with my head. For forensic psychologists, this kind of early exposure often leads to difficulties in establishing boundaries later in life, a pattern that seems to echo in the allegations now facing Diddy. The evidence recovered during the raid added a disturbing layer to these stories. Among the items found in the mansion's basement were journals and photos that painted a vivid picture of Diddy's formative years. One photograph in particular stood out, a young Sean sitting on the staircase watching a party unfold below him. His expression was a mix of wonder and apprehension, a snapshot of a child caught between two worlds. The journals included entries that referenced Sean's presence at these gatherings. While many were brief mentions, they painted a picture of a boy who was always on the periphery, absorbing everything around him. One entry described an instance where Sean wandered into a room he wasn't supposed to be in and was quickly ushered out. "He's curious," the entry noted. "Too much for his own good." This curiosity would later manifest in ways that raised questions about how much his environment influenced his actions as an adult. The allegations against Diddy, including hosting drug-fueled freak-offs and engaging in manipulative behavior, seemed to mirror the excesses he witnessed as a child. Critics have argued that these behaviors are less about inherent character flaws and more about the normalization of such actions during his formative years. But Diddy's story isn't just about what he witnessed, it's also about what he internalized. Those close to him recalled how young Sean would imitate the adults around him, from the way they dressed to the way they spoke. He wanted to be like them. He saw power in what they were doing, and he wanted that for himself. This drive for power and control would become a defining feature of Diddy's persona, both in his career and in his personal life. The mansion itself seemed to hold clues to how deeply these experiences shaped him. Investigators found party memorabilia, film reels, and guest lists that corroborated accounts of the house's infamous gatherings. But beyond the tangible evidence, there was an undeniable sense that the house had been a crucible for Diddy's identity. It was here that he learned about ambition, manipulation, and survival, often in the most unfiltered and unsettling ways. Forensic experts reviewing the case have pointed out how environments like these can create lasting psychological effects. When children are exposed to adult behaviors too early, it changes the way they see the world, one expert explained. They may struggle to form healthy relationships or develop a distorted sense of what's normal. In Sean Combs' case, it seems like those early exposures created a blueprint that influenced his actions as an adult. This blueprint was on full display in the allegations now facing Diddy. From reports of controlling relationships to accusations of fostering a culture of excess, the parallels to his upbringing were hard to ignore. The mansion, once seen as a symbol of resilience and success, now stood as a monument to the complexities and contradictions of his life. But the story didn't end with what had already been uncovered. Investigators believed the mansion held even more secrets, particularly about Diddy's formative years. Journals hinted at interactions and incidents that could provide further insight into how his environment shaped him. These findings were crucial not just for understanding Diddy's past, but also for piecing together the broader narrative of the Combs family's legacy. As the investigation continued, one thing became clear. Diddy's story was as much about his mother's choices as it was about his own. The mansion, with all its secrets and scandals, was more than just a backdrop. It was a character in its own right, shaping and influencing the lives of everyone who passed through its doors. And while the evidence pointed to a childhood steeped in chaos, it also raised questions about accountability. How much of Diddy's behavior could be traced back to his upbringing, and how much was a product of his own choices? These were questions that investigators and the public would grapple with as the case unfolded. The mansion may have been raided, its secrets laid bare, but its impact was far from over. For Sean Combs, the echoes of his childhood would continue to reverberate, shaping not just his legacy, but the way his story was told for years to come. Chapter 6. The evidence speaks. Sometimes the most damning evidence isn't what you see, it's what you hear. As investigators sifted through the trove of items recovered from Janice Combs' mansion, they stumbled upon what could potentially be the most incriminating find yet, a collection of audio and video recordings buried deep within the house's hidden compartments. These tapes were time capsules, offering an unfiltered window into the infamous parties that had taken place decades earlier. The tapes, some marked with cryptic labels like "For Eyes Only" and "Late Night Talks," were stored in dusty boxes tucked away in the mansion's attic. While the photographs and journals found earlier had painted a vivid picture of excess and chaos, these recordings threatened to do something even more damning. They could provide undeniable proof of what truly transpired at Janice's gatherings. He said. Agents carefully examined the contents, starting with the audio recordings. The crackling of old cassette tapes filled the air as investigators leaned in to decipher the conversations captured on them. At first, the recordings seemed innocuous, snippets of music, laughter, and general party chatter. But as they listened more closely, they began to pick up fragments of conversations that hinted at a darker undercurrent. One tape in particular stood out. It captured what appeared to be a heated discussion between two male voices, discussing distribution and the product. The tone was tense, the language vague but suggestive. "The money's there," one voice said. "We just need to make sure the shipment doesn't get delayed again." To the untrained ear, it might have sounded like logistics talk, but to the agents, it reeked of a potential drug deal being negotiated in real time. The recordings didn't just stop at conversations. In another tape, faint music played in the background while the sound of glasses clinking and muffled laughter dominated the foreground. But interspersed were moments of silence, broken by whispers. "He's good for it," one voice said. "He's got connections, but don't push him too hard. We need him on our side." While the identities of the speakers weren't immediately clear, the implications were undeniable. These weren't ordinary party conversations. If the audio recordings hinted at troubling activities, the video recordings left little room for speculation. Investigators found a reel marked Saturday Night Special, which they cautiously loaded into an old projector retrieved from the basement. The grainy footage flickered to life, revealing scenes that ranged from the mundane to the deeply unsettled. The tape opened with a wide shot of a lavishly decorated room filled with partygoers. People danced, laughed, and mingled, their drinks sloshing in their hands as music boomed from the speakers. But as the camera panned across the room, the atmosphere shifted. In one corner, a group of men huddled together, their postures tense and their conversation clearly guarded. Another shot showed a table laden with cash, with one man counting bills while another watched intently. As the footage continued, more disturbing images emerged. At one point, the camera lingered on a couple engaging in what appeared to be an argument, their voices inaudible but their gestures aggressive. In another scene, a man placed a briefcase on the table, opening it to reveal its contents. Though the angle of the camera made it impossible to discern what was inside, the room seemed to hum with tension, the veneer of celebration barely masking the undercurrent of something far more serious. Perhaps the most unsettling moment came toward the end of the reel. The camera focused on a young Sean Combs, standing in a corner with a wide-eyed expression. He looked simultaneously fascinated and out of place, a child caught in a world meant for adults. The sight of him witnessing these moments added an eerie layer to the narrative, raising questions about how much he understood and how much he internalized. The investigators reviewing the footage were struck by its rawness. This wasn't just a party, it was a microcosm of power, indulgence, and secrecy. The recordings captured not just the actions but the dynamics of those present, who held authority, who sought favor, and who simply tried to blend into the background. The implications of these findings were staggering. If authenticated, the tapes could serve as concrete evidence of illegal activities taking place within the mansion. They could also potentially implicate prominent figures whose names had already surfaced in connection with the Combs family's past. For years, rumors had swirled about the mansion's guest list, including individuals tied to Harlem's criminal underworld. Now, those rumors seemed closer than ever to being confirmed. But beyond the legal ramifications, the tapes reignited questions about Janice Combs' role in her son's upbringing. As a mother, was she oblivious to the impact of these gatherings on her young son, or was she complicit in exposing him to this environment? The footage of a young Diddy standing amidst the chaos was a haunting reminder of the blurred boundaries that defined his childhood. Forensic experts suggested that these experiences likely had a profound psychological effect on Diddy. When children are exposed to environments where adult behaviors are normalized, it can create a distorted sense of what's acceptable, one expert explained. They may grow up believing that power and control are tied to indulgence and manipulation. The fallout from these discoveries was immediate. Media outlets seized on the revelations, publishing headlines that painted a damning picture of the Combs family's past. Legal analysts speculated on how the tapes might be used in court, both in the ongoing federal case against Diddy and in any future investigations stemming from the mansions. The public reaction was equally intense. For fans and critics alike, the tapes added a new dimension to the narrative surrounding Sean Combs. To some, they were evidence of a tragic childhood that explained his later behavior. To others, they were proof of a pattern of indulgence and excess that had been ingrained in him from an early age. But the tapes also raised broader questions about accountability. How much responsibility did Janice Combs bear for the environment she created? And how much could be attributed to the choices Sean made as an adult? These were questions that didn't have easy answers, but they were now impossible to ignore. As investigators continued to analyze the recordings, they hinted that even more damning evidence might emerge. The tapes were just the beginning, fragments of a larger story that was still being pieced together. And while the focus remained on the mansion's past, its implications stretched far beyond its walls. The evidence had spoken, and what it revealed was more than just a history of wild parties. It was a glimpse into a world of power, secrecy, and consequence, a world that had shaped one of the most controversial figures in modern culture. And as the investigation moved forward, the question wasn't just about what else might be uncovered. Chapter 7: Generational Patterns. Does the apple fall far from the tree, or does it grow roots in the same soil? For Sean Diddy Combs, the line between his mother's choices and his own actions seems increasingly blurred. As investigators and the public processed the findings from Janice Combs's mansion, a troubling picture began to emerge. One not just of a chaotic home, but of generational patterns of behavior and influence that may have perpetuated cycles of power and trauma. Janice Combs was, by all accounts, a determined and resourceful woman. Left to raise her children alone after the murder of her husband Melvin, she worked multiple jobs to ensure her family's survival. But behind the narrative of resilience lay an environment steeped in turbulence. Her parties, which brought together Harlem's elite and underworld figures, were more than just social events. They became a stage for excess, indulgence, and unspoken deals. A world where boundaries were blurred and values reshaped. For young Sean, growing up in such an environment meant absorbing lessons far beyond his years. The mansion, long thought of as a place of success and upward mobility, also became a hub of exposure to adult behaviors. Tim Patterson, a childhood friend, once remarked, "Sean didn't just live in that house, he was shaped by it. Everything that went on, he saw, he learned, and he carried with him." As the investigation into Janice's mansion unfolded, parallels between her choices and Diddy's actions began to surface. The allegations against Diddy, ranging from hosting drug-fueled freak-offs to manipulating and abusing those in his circle, seemed to echo the very environment he was exposed to as a child. Critics argued that the normalization of such behaviors in his formative years laid the groundwork for his later controversies. Janice's influence on her son wasn't just about what she allowed to happen in her home. It was also about what she modeled. The tapes recovered from the mansion revealed moments of power plays and negotiations that highlighted her ability to navigate complex dynamics. While her intentions may have been rooted in survival and ambition, the methods she employed sent a clear message. Power could be wielded through charm, manipulation, and control. For Diddy, these lessons became tools. His rise in the music industry was marked by his ability to command a room, negotiate deals, and maintain an aura of invincibility. But the same traits that fueled his success also seemed to contribute to his downfall. Allegations of controlling relationships, abusive behavior, and fostering environments of excess mirrored the very chaos he had grown up around. One striking parallel lay in the alleged freak-offs that became a focal point of lawsuits against Diddy. These gatherings, described as drug-fueled orgies where consent was a blurred line, bore a chilling resemblance to the scenes captured in the tapes from Janice's parties. The patterns of indulgence and excess didn't just repeat, they escalated. Forensic psychologists analyzing the case suggested that these behaviors were part of a larger cycle of trauma and power. When children are exposed to environments where control and manipulation are normalized, they often internalize those dynamics, one expert explained. They may replicate them as adults, either consciously or unconsciously, as a way of asserting their own power or coping with unresolved trauma. But the implications of these findings didn't stop with Diddy. The question of how these patterns might affect future generations loomed large. Diddy's children, many of whom have grown up in the public eye, now faced the dual legacy of their father's fame and controversy. Would they too be shaped by the cycles of power and trauma that defined their family's history? Investigators uncovered journals in the mansion that hinted at the intergenerational nature of these dynamics. One entry written by Janice reflected on her own upbringing and the challenges she faced as a young woman navigating Harlem's complexities. "You do what you have to do to survive," she wrote. "Sometimes that means making choices you never thought you'd have to make." While the entry offered a glimpse into her mindset, it also highlighted the ways in which survival often came at the expense of stability. For Diddy's children, the stakes were even higher. Growing up in a digital age where every scandal and allegation was magnified, they faced the added pressure of living under the shadow of their father's legacy. Friends of the family described them as caught between two worlds, the privilege of their upbringing and the weight of the controversies surrounding their name. The findings from the mansion also raised questions about accountability. How much of Diddy's behavior could be attributed to his upbringing, and how much was a result of his own choices? Similarly, to what extent was Janice responsible for the environment she created, and to what degree was she a product of her own circumstances? These were questions that didn't have easy answers, but they were central to understanding the cycles of power and trauma that seemed to define the Combs family. The tapes and artifacts recovered from the mansion were more than just evidence of past events. They were a roadmap of influence and consequence. They painted a picture of a family navigating survival, ambition, and power, often at great personal and moral cost. And while the mansion's walls could no longer contain these secrets, the legacy of what happened within them continued to ripple outward. For Sean Diddy Combs, the revelations from his family's past added a new layer to his public persona. He was no longer just a controversial mogul under scrutiny. He was also a product of an environment that blurred the lines between survival and excess. And as the investigation continued, the connections between past and present became impossible to ignore. The story of Janice Combs' mansion wasn't just about wild parties or scandalous recordings. It was a story about cycles of power, trauma, and influence that spanned generations. And as the public grappled with these revelations, one question remained: would these cycles ever be broken, or were they destined to repeat? Chapter 8. The questions that remain. What happens when a family's past collides with their present? For Sean Diddy Combs and his mother Janice, the raid on their family mansion didn't just unearth decades-old secrets. It set off a chain reaction of consequences that neither could have foreseen. As news of the investigation spread, the public and media latched onto every detail, turning the Combs family into the center of a storm that blurred the lines between scandal, speculation, and accountability. And now he was about to be forced to live with the implications forever, as the life he'd once loved turned into a delusion and false memories for the rest of his life. The immediate aftermath of the raid was explosive. Headlines declared, "Federal agents uncover shocking evidence in Diddy's childhood home," while social media erupted with theories about what the mansion's secrets might reveal. For fans of Diddy, the revelations were difficult to reconcile with the image of the charismatic mogul who had built an empire from the ground up. For his critics, however, the raid was a confirmation of what they had long suspected, that the chaos surrounding him wasn't incidental but deeply rooted in his upbringing. The legal implications were just as significant as the public reaction. Federal investigators hinted at potential charges that could arise from the evidence recovered in the mansion. While Janice had always been seen as a secondary figure in Diddy's story, a supportive mother in the background, her alleged role in hosting and facilitating these infamous gatherings now placed her under scrutiny. Could she face charges for activities that had taken place decades ago? And if so, what would that mean for her legacy and her family? For Diddy, the timing of the raid couldn't have been worse. Already embroiled in legal battles stemming from allegations of sexual misconduct and trafficking, the findings from the mansion threatened to add another layer of complexity to his defense. The tapes, journals, and photographs recovered from the house painted a picture of a childhood marked by exposure to power dynamics and behaviors that mirrored the allegations against him. While his legal team argued that his upbringing shouldn't be used as evidence against him, prosecutors saw the mansion's history as a window into the roots of his alleged actions. One of the most pressing questions was whether the tapes and records would implicate other prominent figures. Over the years, rumors had swirled about the guest lists for Janice's parties, with names ranging from local kingpins to influential business people. If the evidence confirmed these connections, the fallout could extend far beyond the Combs family, potentially dragging Harlem's elite and even national figures into the spotlight. But it wasn't just about the legal and social ramifications. The raid also forced a deeper reckoning with the cycles of power, trauma, and influence that had defined the Combs family for generations. Forensic psychologists and cultural commentators weighed in, arguing that the investigation wasn't just about uncovering crimes, it was about understanding how environments of unchecked indulgence and secrecy perpetuate harmful behaviors. And it inspired people to look inward to delve into their own sense of purpose and meaning. Some 55 web commentators were killed in the process, and hundreds more were hurt. The public reaction was divided. Some saw Diddy as a victim of his circumstances, shaped by an upbringing he couldn't control. Others argued that his actions as an adult couldn't be excused by his past, no matter how chaotic it might have been. The debate highlighted a broader societal question: how much of a person's behavior can be attributed to their environment, and where does personal accountability begin, like pregnancy? Amid the growing speculation, the Combs family remained silent. Janice, who had always projected an air of resilience, refused to comment on the raid or the allegations. Her silence was interpreted in different ways. Some saw it as guilt, others as a dignified refusal to engage with the media frenzy. Diddy, meanwhile, issued a carefully worded statement through his legal team, emphasizing his focus on clearing his name and protecting his family. But even as the Combs family worked to contain the fallout, the questions surrounding the mansion's history continued to grow. Investigators hinted at connections between the house and broader criminal networks, suggesting that the parties held there weren't just social gatherings, but hubs for deals and alliances that shaped Harlem's underworld. These revelations added another layer of intrigue to the story, transforming the mansion from a symbol of familial success into a nexus of power and corruption. The raid also raised questions about the role of memory and history in shaping identity. For many, the mansion represented more than just a physical space. It was a repository of stories, secrets, and struggles that defined the Combs family. The artifacts recovered from the house weren't just evidence. They were fragments of a larger narrative, pieces of a puzzle that investigators and the public were still trying to assemble. When they remounted the comets, the sky was now controlled by the most captivating of spaces, the world of the comets. As the investigation unfolded, one thing became clear. The mansion's secrets weren't just about the past. They had profound implications for the present and future. For Diddy, the revelations threatened to overshadow his career and legacy, casting a long shadow over his achievements. For Janice, they raised uncomfortable questions about her choices and their impact on her children. And for the broader community, they served as a stark reminder of how cycles of power and trauma can shape lives in ways that are both visible and invisible. The final chapter of this story has yet to be written. While the evidence recovered from the mansion continues to be analyzed, the public is left to grapple with the broader questions it raises. What does it mean to uncover hidden truths about a family, a community, or a culture? And how do we reconcile those truths with the narratives we've built around them? In the end, the raid on Janice Combs' mansion was more than just an investigation. It was a confrontation with the past, a reckoning with the choices and circumstances that shape who we are. And while the full impact of these revelations is still unfolding, one thing is certain: the story of the Combs family is far from over. For now, the mansion stands as a silent witness to decades of secrets, its walls no longer able to hold the weight of what they once concealed. And as the world waits for the next chapter, the question lingers: how much of our own history might still remain in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered?